best music. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Love and awareness of 558. 558. Your best music. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Love and awareness of 558. 558. Caroline 558. Your best music. Caroline 558. Love and awareness of 558.
That's from the new album by Billy Joel. The album called The Bridge, that was Modern Woman, Caroline 558. Say hello to my brother Stephen and his wife. Good morning to the both of them. They've got a very clever son, actually. He's only 2 years old, and he can already spell his name backwards and forwards. Yeah, very clever he is. His name's Otto. 16 minutes to 8. Good morning, Caroline 558. Who's this then? That's it, status quo. I think we'll have a change as far as breakfast is concerned this morning. We'll leave the Marmite out today. Don't want too much this. Do like a bit of Marmite, but I think we'll have a change today. Sausage and eggs. That's what I fancy. Fancy other things as well, but I can't eat them at the moment. Gotta work. 9 minutes to 8. Music Radio, Caroline 558. The breakfast program, now with Lionel Richie. Everybody on this ship calls me Big John, you know. I'm glad my dad didn't call me William. It's 6 minutes to 8, Caroline 558, Music Radio from the North Sea. And the sun is shining today. I would say hello to John and Tracy Spargo, they're from Dover. Good morning to you. Also hello to Alan Spargo, he's in Malden in Essex this morning. Right, shall we have our piece of graffiti for today? Do you want a piece of graffiti? Yeah, here we go. This is it, our writing on the wall. It may be quicker by train, but it's more fun with a slow coach. That was near the board, wasn't it? Have you got a favourite piece of graffiti you'd like to send to me? Then please do, love to hear from you. The wackier the better. John Lewis, Radio Caroline, New York 11518 in the US of A. Radio Caroline, New York 11518 in the US of A. Now on with the music. This is it. Daryl Hall and John Oates. And this song from a couple of years ago, Out of Touch.
Shake it up, it's all that we know.
That's from the new album by Billy Joel.
Caroline 558. Caroline 558.
Goedemiddag, good afternoon, and welcome to the Caroline 558 panel. I'm Steve. Before we kick into it, I'll introduce the various people I know. My face has changed over the years, and some of the other faces have aged just a little. So, on the far right, though not politically, we have Richard Staines, or Steve Silby. He is the man who left the day I arrived. I think I must have said something. So, Johnny Lewis, of course, who was a mainstay of Caroline 558 in the early years, and a man who really needs no introduction. Mark Matthews, who was around in, I think, 85, 86 and 87. He was the person who gave me my first program slot on Caroline. He had the patience of a saint with me in my early days, but he was a bit of a sinner as well. He was always getting me into all kinds of trouble. And then on my left, a man I actually never met before today, but a very distinctive voice on Caroline 558, John Dwyer. Then the amazing Peter Phillips, a man I shall be coming back to shortly, and Ray Clark on my far left. So I want to start off with Peter Phillips, because I just want to explore one little portion of Caroline 558, and that is the music and the ethos, because Caroline 558 isn't just a radio station on a frequency. It was really a whole set of programming, ethos and music and records, and a very, very clever way of using the ship's record library. So could you tell me a little bit just about the inspiration for the whole Caroline 558 system and the music that we played?
No. It was very simply. It seemed to me when I joined that it was a little bit of a dog's breakfast, I suppose would be the expression. It didn't seem to me that there was very much of a theme to the music, and that the library wasn't really being explored to its full potential. And I discussed this with Ronan when I went to shore, and he said, would I put something together? So I sat down and spent the whole of that shore leave working out the gist of what I thought it ought to be. And I spent many happy hours with Ronan in coffee houses in Chelsea. You know how it was. And he agreed that was probably the way forward. So I went out and put it into practice, and it turned out to be bleeding difficult to achieve. But we got there, and I think we achieved a sound during that time.
And I think the start of that music format more or less coincided with Caroline moving to 558, so that the two things kind of came around the same time, didn't they?
Well, yes, I suppose we'd already got it in place when we were still on 576, but it was fortunate and serendipitous that we were able to have that format in place when we moved to 558, because it seemed to fit very well in the circumstances. Yeah.
So you were really, the mainstay of Caroline in, I guess, from about 1985 through until into 1988. And you came there from Radio Jackie. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about kind of that transition and what it was like for you?
Well, I'd been rattling around in radio for a little while before that. I'd done The Voice of Peace in Israel, and I'd done Nova in Italy. I'd done sort of one or two bits and pieces, and as you say, that finished up. I'd actually been working the land-based pirate scene in London for a little while. I don't know if you remember, but we went through a phase in London where it was virtually impossible for the authorities to do anything about us because they had to give 6 months' notice before a raid, and it was hardly worth their while bothering. And so we were, to all intents and purposes, we were operating as legitimate commercial stations, and Radio Jackie was one of those. And I went, and because of some of the radio stations that I'd worked for previously, I knew most of the people who were there. So yes, I went and worked for Radio Jackie. And then the law changed in Britain, and all of a sudden it was possible for the authorities to raid, and we sort of saw this coming. We knew it was going to happen, and sure enough, it did. Curiously, we left the door open for them, thinking, they're going to come and raid us. But they felt cheated by this, and so they smashed the door down with a fireman's axe anyway. And nice people. And they came in and they closed us down. And so I popped out to Radio Caroline, for want of anything better to do, you may say. Although I have to say, that's slightly understating it. I wanted to go to Caroline. It wasn't just a matter of wanting something to do. That was certainly something that I had intended to do at some stage, one way or another. And that happened in late 84. And so I was there from very late 84 through 85, as you say, and into 88. So
when you joined the station, it's kind of just in those pre-558 days, and I know it had been a little bit ropey in terms of how things were going supply-wise in the earliest days of the Ross Revenge. And as far as I can see, it got very, very good and very slick in the middle, and then it tailed off a little bit after the Mast came down. For you, what was the best time that you had there?
I think it was all good. I don't think there was there was never really a time when I wished I wasn't there. It was all good and it was all fruitful, and I think we built a good audience. We had some good times. In terms of supplies, you say that they started off ropey and improved. I don't remember them improving, actually, if I'm honest. I think they were always pretty shaky. We just we got better at making the best of it. And even when the mast came down, that was an interesting challenge, putting something back on air. That was certainly a great blow. I mean, it was losing that mast was a blow, and it was an awful pity. And I've always felt avoidable, but that's a slightly different matter. But we put another one up, and we got back on air, and even that was fun in its way.
I just want to take you back to one particular morning, which I think was one of your finest hours. So could we have clip number 3C, please?
Having trouble getting up this morning? I have a recommendation. Potter about on the bridge of a ship and take about half the North Sea in the face. It's pretty bracing. 27 minutes past 8, we're Caroline 558. Back to the 60s now with Tommy Rowe, remember, Busy. Staggeringly little in the way of public transport today. No trains, no tubes, and the roads aren't much better. Most roads into London are blocked, and a good number of roads in the whole of Kent, Essex, and Hampshire are blocked. It's flooding and winds and fallen trees and that sort of thing that's doing the damage. Basically, police are warning you not to travel unless it's absolutely necessary. We're Caroline 558 from the North Sea. Oh, sorry about that. It took just a trifle more than 20 minutes. We did it's the all-new salt-encrusted breakfast programme from Caroline 558 with a wet Peter Phillips here with you, hopefully through until 10, playing the music of Billy Idol, his latest hit, Mony Mony.
So tell me what you remember of the day of the hurricane.
I remember not believing that there was a hurricane. I was dug out of bed, I don't know, probably about 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that, quite early, by Mike Watts, the engineer, and he said, you better get up, there's a hurricane going on outside. And are there children here? I better not. My precise words were, I think I may have said fuck off, but or I might have put it stronger, but anyway, the gist of it was that I didn't believe a word of it, but I popped upstairs and it became very quickly clear that there was. But the reason why I didn't believe a word of it was that the ship wasn't moving. You know, everybody imagines it was terribly rough out there in the hurricane. It really wasn't.
I do remember that travel bulletin that we just heard you read. I typed that up and I handed it to you. And I remember you looking at it and saying to me, are you sure that sounds like a bit of an overreaction?
Well, it was a bit difficult to give credence to, wasn't it? Because the ship was sitting solid as a rock, hanging on the end of an anchor. It felt like a calm day, really, when you were down below. It was only when you got upstairs and tried to look through a porthole that you realised that what you were actually seeing was the North Sea passing by at speed. And there was... there was little else to be seen because there was just simply a wall of water going past very, very quickly. And at that point, you started to realise that actually there was a hurricane or something close to it. But no, I don't remember being in the slightest bit alarmed about that. It got worse, though. When the bits started to fall off the mast in the middle of the programme, it was slightly unsettling and disruptive. And we did have to fix those. We tied a couple of stays back in the middle of the programme, which is not an ideally professional way of doing it, just sort of bailing out of a programme and saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to go and fix a couple of stays on the mast, but it needs must, and we went and did it. But it was later on in the day when the wind started to die down and the ship started to move sideways to the swell, that's when we really felt it, and it really did get a bit unpleasant at that time.
I do remember later that day when it calmed down enough that we had to go off the air again because there was some further damage. And we went out on deck, and I'd never seen this before, but the entire outside deck of the ship was encrusted with bits of seaweed, bits of timber, flotsam, jetsam, stuff that normally would just float past us and had just been kind of hurled over the sides of the ship when it was lying around the place. You actually climbed up to the very top of the mast that afternoon while the wind was still blowing?
I don't think I went quite to the top, but I went I don't know, half, 2/3 of the way up, because there was a bit flapping about up there, and somebody needed to go up and do it. I was younger then. I used to climb masts back then. It was a mess, that storm. What was more impressive was going back to shore, because of course back in those days we used to spend quite a long time on the ship, weeks, months really at a time, most times. And when I got back to shore after that hurricane, England did not look the same at all, which was not what I was expecting.
I do remember as well, just you talk about things flapping about up in the mast, and you've always been known as being pretty unflappable yourself. Your own words that morning when you woke me up, "Good morning, Steve. It's a trifle rough out there."
Did I say that? I perhaps felt that you ought to be more gently eased into the situation than I was. I don't really remember exactly what I said, or indeed what you might have said to me at the time. Possibly the same as my reaction to Mike. I don't know.
Now, it was only a month after that. In fact, 25 years ago, this day next week, that the big tower came down. And I know you were away. You were in the USA at the time. Mm-hmm. How did you get the news, and what did you feel when you heard that?
Well, I understand that most people who hadn't actually seen it didn't believe it. You may gather that I'm not easily convinced of anything very much. I didn't believe in the hurricane. I didn't really believe the tower had come down either. And when I was told that it had, I was imagining that maybe the top section had dropped off or something of that sort. And I wasn't expecting to find that there was 6 inches of it still standing when I got out there. That was a huge blow. I got the news. I was in America. And somebody said the tower had come down, but I didn't know what they meant by the tower had come down, whether they meant a bit of it had or the whole thing.
So just moving over to Ray for a moment. I know you did a spell on Caroline in 87, but you were actually out there before that, and you had a somewhat unusual experience. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, there were a number of them. I'm trying to think which one you might think, Steve, but I was ever the Anorak and still am. My dream as a kid and growing up was to go to Caroline. I honestly never dreamed, one, that I'd get out there to play records with the likes of these guys, and two, to make a career out of being on the radio for 25 years. But give us a clue, Steve, and I'll see if I can pick up the story.
Well, someone was telling me about you being put on board on an Anorak trip, and then the boat disappeared and left you stranded.
Yeah, that was quite a day. And well, there are about 50 other Anoraks that shared that experience. We went out from Brightlingsea. It was a big Sunday. There were 2 boats, and we went out. I seem to remember a glorious day, thank goodness, out to the Ross. And we were just getting on board the second of the boats, and somebody shouted out, "Here come the police!" And the Essex Rivers Alert 3 turned up. And with that, one of the boats that had brought us out with about 20 people on board decided that they'd go off fishing and then return to Brightlingsea. So that meant not only was the world-famous Radio Caroline fully staffed with broadcast crew, but it had 20 people that loved the idea of being there for a couple of hours but didn't intend spending the next 2 weeks there. And for a while, that's what it looked like. And there were frantic calls from Johnny in particular, on the radio trying to, I'm not going to name him, but Bill Rollins, who was the landman, trying to arrange transport for 20 people back home. Now, for many of us, we quite liked it. And in fact, Johnny said, "Lad, do you want to stay?" And I thought, oh, well, what do I do? Do I go to work tomorrow and earn the money to pay the mortgage, or do I stay and fulfill a dream? But I went eventually when a boat turned up at midnight, and bear in mind we'd left Brightlingsea at about 6 o'clock that morning. This boat turned up at midnight and took us back to Ramsgate. So there were 20 people that had started in Brightlingsea, and if geography of the UK isn't that good, it's a bit like leaving Den Helder, and the boat to take you home took you to Vlissingen, and you had to get between the two. So not only was this boat turning up with coloured lights and music playing at midnight, but these happy Anoraks going back to Ramsgate, but there was a fleet of cars that had ferried down from Essex, and eventually we got back to Essex at about 7 o'clock that morning, and just in time for me to phone up and say, "I won't be in today. I think I must have ate something yesterday. It's disagreed with me."
It obviously didn't put you off because you came back out.
No,
and you broadcast on Caroline in '87.
Yeah, and I am so proud of that. I still feel a little bit of a fraud because I only did one stint. Although strangely enough, I was due to be out when the mast came down. I was earning a living as a coach driver, and as I say, the mortgage had to be paid, and there was I'd been asked if I'd like to go back out in November with Kevin Turner as one. And I said, well, yes, but my boss just wants me to do a week away and then I'll come out and I want to keep him happy. And when the time came to go out, it was just too rough. And I remember getting a call, I think it was Cosmic, and he said, whatever happens, you'll be going out on Saturday, even if the wind's blowing. He might possibly have said, even if there's a hurricane, but whatever, you'll be going out on Saturday. And I put the phone down, and I live on the coast, and the wind was blowing a hoolie, and I'm not the best sailor. And I thought, what have I done? And I went to bed the next morning, woke up to Caroline, but I didn't. It wasn't there, and that was the day the mast came down. So, yes, I should have been out there. God, am I happy and glad that I wasn't. But I take my hat off to those that were.
We tend to think, by the way, the people who managed to escape after one stint are not the frauds, they're the people who had the sense. So, John Dwyer, you were a very recognisable voice on 558 in 1986. Tell us a little bit about your time.
Yeah, well, I was a sort of token northerner, so it was very easy to work out, even though you couldn't distinguish the accent of Liverpool, Merseyside, that I was from the north of England. I'd been working in the Republic of Ireland, and I got a call from a mate of mine who had been on the ship, Trevor James, and he was leaving the station to go and get a job on land, and threw my name into the hat, which then resulted in me getting a call from I think it was either Andy or Cosmic or Tom Anderson. Anyhow, in the May of '86, I went down and met Ronan with Andy and Tom, and had a coffee at I think it was the Dome Coffee Bar in the King's Road, and spoke to Ronan and briefly asked him about conditions and money. And he said the conditions will be all right, and in the usual Irish blarney, he said, don't worry about the money. He said, if you look after Caroline will look after you. Which I thought was quite nice, but I later found out that he said that to everybody.
Particularly gullible, are you?
Well, I was keen to get on the ship, and so I was out the following month, June. Stayed right the way through until the 23rd of December that year, and spent quite a fair chunk of that period on board the ship. And had a ball. Great.
And if you had to look back, what was your best memory from your time there?
Well, there were so many really. I got permission off Peter Chicago to paint the bells at the side of the ship. I asked him once, "How is it there's no Caroline bell at the side of the ship?" He said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, can I paint a bell?" And he said, "Well, let me think about it." And he came back and said, "As long as you don't make a pig's ear of it, you can do it, but you've got to get it right. You make sure you do it okay. Put the 558 on one side, 963 on the other." There was that. I was an unofficial tour guide to the many visitor boats that came out, showing people around, asking questions, trying to give them answers, and just so many different things. Playing the music between the God tapes. I think I introduced people to Bert Kampfert and Klaus Wunderlich, and various other instrumental groups and outfits. It's good.
That's great. Just moving over to Mark Matthews. You were, I guess, one of the more select band of people who worked both on 558 and also on Overdrive.
Yeah. Well, the early days of Overdrive, there was, looking back on it now, it's very interesting what's been said about the format that was put in. I've been at radio stations 15 years on from Radio Caroline where they're saying, we don't think you should be playing your own stuff anymore. We're going to bring in this format. I think, hang on a minute, I was doing this 15 years ago on Radio Caroline and they're starting to bring this stuff in later. But we were young and we were a bit rebellious, and we sort of embraced the Caroline Overdrive ethos as well, which is something different to put on at night. So you'd have Radio Monique, of course, and then you'd have Viewpoint 963. And lots of Bert Kampfert, and then Caroline Overdrive after 9. So we used to do some weird shifts. So we'd often do a show on 558, and then we'd end up doing a show on Caroline Overdrive, either in the evening or sort of going through the night and then doing something early the following day.
I found it quite interesting as a listener at that time, because there were sort of overdrive people who would occasionally do a show on 558 if they felt forced to, and vice versa. But you were a person, you sounded absolutely comfortable on both of them.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of feeling it sounds an odd thing to say, but feeling the music and the way you present it, I guess. And it was quite regimented, the way you presented 558, and in the same way, Overdrive was regimented in its own way as well, because we did have people think it was just us turning up and playing our own songs, but we did have a format on there as well. It was done in a very different style, and it's just a case of getting a feel for it. And that experience of being able to do that has actually carried me through my career now. I'm now freelancing on all sorts of different radio shows for the BBC, and some have different feels to others, and probably without Caroline I wouldn't be able to do that, so I'm very grateful for that.
And if I had to ask you which one you preferred?
Oh my word. Yeah, well, it is. Seriously, Johnny's saying, would you like me to flip a coin? I think that it really is that, because I picked up so much from doing both of those different disciplines, and even reading the news. Writing and reading news. I've gone on to do journalism and things. I know we used to rip it from CFAX, but that's not the point, Steve. But we still used to write our own stuff, and a lot of these disciplines that you start with give you invaluable experience, and that's my main concern about radio in the UK now in particular, probably the same elsewhere as well, that people just don't have those outlets now.
Well, I know you, when it comes to writing the news, again, your sense of humour could intrude even into the newsroom.
No.
And there was a morning when I think I was fairly new and you somewhat led me astray, and you wrote this news bulletin for you and I to read together, which consisted of about 16 stories. I don't know if you remember this. Each story slightly less relevant and slightly more inane than the last, ending up with a piece about a 0.5 millimetre measurement change in the standards for Canadian ice hockey.
It was all on CFAX. We just took it from CFAX. We didn't write that ourselves.
So I guess the question has to be asked. Why did you disappear? What made you kind of move on?
I think I got to. So we were discussing before we came in. I can't even actually remember when I left, because you do a stint on the ship, and my longest stint was 20 weeks, and then but normally sort of 6 to 8 weeks you go on land. I used to spend quite a lot of time on land with the aforementioned Cosmic, and so we used to spend a lot of time with Ronan, and so those were invaluable times as well. You knew when things were bad, when the money used to come out of Ronan's sock. That's when you knew things were sort of getting down to the to the brass knuckles. So I had a good couple of years of that, and I think it was just time to move on at that stage. I didn't really have anywhere to go to either, well, rather stupidly. So I probably should have stayed on a bit longer and gone through the whole thing with the Mast. But I think it was just time to move on, and that happens, doesn't it?
And Johnny, you were the quintessential 558 breakfast person, really. What are your memories of 558 as opposed to all of the other versions of Caroline that you did?
Well, I won't go on too long because I know we're short of time. But I think when Peter Phillips came on and we put the format together, it actually had some direction. The problem is when I went back out to Caroline in August '84, I come from a background at ABC in Ireland, Sunshine Radio, Radio Nova in Ireland, where we had a very strict format. And it seemed very alien to me that it was one of those where you went on and played, what you want, which sounds great, but my musical choice is probably totally different to like Tom Anderson. So, I make no bones about it. I prefer the more poppier tracks. I'm not one of the heavy rock brigade. So, 1 minute you could get like loads of poppy stuff, next minute loads of heavy stuff, which doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. So when Graham came on with the format, the whole thing, I mean, you could hear it from the air check tape that we heard. We were sort of remarking, blimey, it even sounds fresh today, doesn't it? That was how fresh it was, and that was probably, 85, Graham? that taken from the air check?
Yeah, around, that would have been just after. Well, that particular one would have been
probably just after Laser went, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think and the station was working. I mean, you could tell that from the mail that was that started coming in. All right. We had something in our favour when Laser went in. That we hopped on the frequency more or less within hours. But the whole thing just gelled and it worked, and it gave us a sense of purpose. Yeah, we came in for some stick, but when you think about what was, the station people talk about, Veronica, London, North Sea, they what do they have all in common? They had a very strict format. So, and I was totally in favour of it.
So, Peter Phillips and Johnny Lewis were two really of the giant names of the Caroline 558 era. The other one who I'll always associate with making 558 the really great station that it was Kevin Turner. Now, Kevin isn't here with us today, but we are going to just hear a little bit of Kevin's voice. We spoke a little bit earlier about ship-to-shore communication and what do we do when we need to get some people rescued from the ship, or when we need to change the programs that are running on the overdrive service. Well, there used to be a very, very dedicated guy called Bill who had a CB set, and he used to stand on the beach in Essex at, I think it was around 5:45 every evening. And
actually, Bill's here. He could stand up. Yeah. Are you in there, mate?
Stand up, Bill. Go on, stand up. Round of applause.
Round of applause,
man.
Can we just also say Bill did this, at quite a risk. I mean,
huge risk.
A huge risk. I mean, what we used to do was talk on one channel, and he'd reply on another. Then the next sentence we'd talk on one channel and reply on another.
And we had a list for each date of the month. And today is the 18th.
Yeah.
We're on channel 36 and channel 24.
And we always used to start with, "You in there, mate?"
The other thing which I always remember about Bill, every night he used to say this to me. When the time came that it used to be me talking to him, he used to say the same thing to me over and over again. And of course, it was proved to be true. And that was, "It'll all end in tears, mate." But I just want to play in a clip now of the wonderful Kevin Turner having one of these ship-to-shore conversations with Bill.
Yeah, whenever you like, it's all rolling.
The first thing is stop 91, stop 91, and stop the Thursday 86, and keep the Sunday 86, over.
Yeah, got all that, all understood, over.
Okay, stand by for the 22nd.
Yeah, all rolling, over.
Incidentally, those stops are immediate effect, over.
Okay, the moment I finish here, we'll do that one. Okay, all understood, over.
Okay, stand by. Okay, mate, here we go. It is 27, 31, 33, 34, 39, 46 plus 44. 2/916-542. 5/138499. 72/3078, over.
Yeah, all got on that one. Go on the next, over.
127, 29, 34, 42, 48 plus 33, 3/303520, 184/3784, over.
Yeah, I've got all that, house, and how much have I won? Looking at the other one, my list here runs out at 89. My list runs out at 89, and I'm not too sure what 91 is. Oh, hang on, no, beg your pardon, I've just discovered where they all are. Okay, yeah, we'll stop those as instructed, over.
Okay, mate, okay, yeah, have a nice weekend, and catch you later. I'll be about Monday.
Okay, talk to you then, have a good one, bye now.
So just in case you didn't get that, that was, I think, an instruction to stop an edition of a particular Viewpoint program. And then the Lotto 649 numbers, if you ever wondered how we got the winning numbers and the prize details.
I wanted to know, did any of the horses win? You were never that good on shortwave, Bill.
But Bill did this at amazing risk, and I think you were kind of followed or observed on a few occasions.
Yeah, there was one time that I often used to do it driving along the seafront at Clacton, you know, and I was driving along, I think it was a morning, giving it the, you know, CB thing, calling you, and as I looked up, there is the, as it was then, the DTI car, you know, which looked like a hedgehog. You know, hundreds of aerials on this bloody car, just pulling out in front of me, and I thought, Jesus, I'm in it now. So I dropped the mic and just kept driving, and he went the other way. And never did. I mean, how it went on all through Eurosiege, and it was going all through the Eurosiege time.
So, I mean, you know, we were relatively safe in legal terms, actually out of the ship, but, you know, there is a man who actually was putting his freedom on the line. So, round of applause for Bill.
And Steve, you mentioned that he did it in the evening. He also did it in the mornings as well. So it was twice a day. We actually spoke to Bill.
So I just want to bring in Richard Staines, who was around on Caroline just before I arrived. And I know you were there around the end of 86 and the beginning of 87. Now, you're one of those very strange people, which I would regard as kind of being normal, in that you arrived into Caroline from somewhere else in radio. You did one stint and you got away before you got the cabin fever. So
no,
you
I didn't
really
get the cash.
Yeah.
That was
you really had the opportunity to experience Caroline 558, you know, as an outsider without getting too deeply involved. So how did you view it? How did you see it?
Well, it was fabulously clandestine. It was only in recent years I sailed in after a particularly rough crossing in the Bay of Biscay into Santander. And I thought at that moment, how did this all come together? It was completely remarkable. But it was very clandestine. I never met Ronan. There was no money in the sock for me or behind the painting or anything like that. But I remember Andy Cosmic Johnson meeting me at Victoria Station, 3 o'clock in the morning, spending the night on Tom Anderson's U-boat. And then going out to the Ross in the middle of the night on this fabulous Bellatrix. I was warned, because I'd been on the peace ship immediately before the Ross Revenge. Oh, you're not going to the Ross Revenge. Terrible there. You know, it's falling apart. When I was taken there in luxury, and when I got there, it was, you know, full of cigarettes and beer and chicory. As an Englishman and cooking, I had no idea what to do with chicory. I thought you put it in coffee, but apparently you Dutch guys like chicory. And of course, there was plenty of Dutch guys on board. But I think your question was about normal. There was nothing normal about it. It was an extraordinary experience.
And, you know, compared to the other stations, because you were on some quite successful stations in Ireland around that time, how did you find it in terms of how it was run and its impact?
It was very tightly formatted, although there was, as I remember, and maybe Peter Phillips can help jog my memory, but there was this curious clock position, which was, I think it was known as the old boy's favourite. And we'd be playing, you know, all this top 40 music, but we'd still have to play a bit of Bob Dylan or something like that because the old man liked it. And there was kind of this owly aberration. That's correct, that memory, is it?
I'm not sure that is correct.
Oh.
I think the aberration is the fact I was the old man who liked it. I put that stuff in there. But I put it there because I believed our audience liked Bob
Could I
Dylan.
just say, by the way, I'm glad I lived long enough to hear you swear posh. It was a wonderful experience. But no, I had a very nice time out there. It was very comfortable. There was Herbert Visser was on board, Ad Roberts, Peter Chicago was on board. I was there with Peter Phillips, Kevin Turner. Actually, interestingly enough, and this is very curious, I was there with exactly the same crew as I'd been with on the peace ship. We manoeuvred it so that we'd all be on the Ross Revenge at the same time. So we'd had a great summer in Israel, but we also spent the winter in the North Sea. And one of the guys who had been on the peace ship with me and had got to the Ross Revenge before I got there was a guy called Keith Lewis. And his passport expired while sitting on the Ross Revenge. and he couldn't leave. And there was all this panic on how to get him a passport whilst he was sitting, 20 miles out at sea. Eventually, we did manage to get a passport, and he did leave, but we got the best out of him before he did, as I remember.
That's great. So we actually have a second contingent of 558 people here, including the wonderful Peter Chicago and Nigel Harris and Dave Richards and some others. So if we could do a little bit of a swap around now and Wave 2 could come along, perhaps we could play just a couple of the clips, anything at random while that's taking place.
Best music, Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Love and awareness of 558. 558. Your best music, Caroline 558. Caroline 558. Love and awareness of 558. 558. Caroline.
On 558 kilohertz, this is Radio Caroline. Caroline International News, brought to you by Newsweek magazine.
Good evening, it's 1 minute past 6. This is Dave Richards. And finally, the Department of Trade and Industry vessel Landward is still within the vicinity of the Radio Caroline ship MV Ross Revenge. Throughout the day, talks have been taking place between the two vessels. A representative from Radio Caroline held talks with DTI officials aboard the DTI vessel. That's all for now, there'll be more at 7.
Caroline 558.
Tax-free in Canada, $1 million. The game is Lotto 649. Choose any 6 numbers between 1 and 49. Send them with your name, address, and £15 cash, check, or money order to Bet Canada, Box 5555, Vancouver, Canada, V6B 4B5. Your numbers will play for 13 consecutive games after receipt. Allow 4 to 6 weeks for confirmation.
So while we're on the subject of big names from the 558 era, one person who also isn't here, and I just thought I would mention his name, it has been mentioned already, who was one of those key voices at that time, Andy Cosmic Johnson. Wonderful, wonderful guy. And I was just reminded of him hearing the Lotto 649 advert. We had at one point, there was a Lotto 649 advert that ran for about 2.5 minutes. It was this monster. And I remember him introducing it one night and saying, "This is Caroline, Europe's largest commercial station." So, well, who have we got here now? We have got some of the best and the brightest people that spanned really both the early and the later eras on 558. Nigel Harris, who is a man I was very, very privileged to serve alongside on board the ship. And listening back to some of the recordings of his 558 shows in later days, I have to say, when I win the lottery and I buy my own radio station, this is the man who's going to be on the breakfast show.
If you win the lottery, can you buy me a car?
I'll buy you a car to get to the breakfast show.
Thank you. And double glazing as well. Thank you very much.
Dave Richards, another very distinctive voice who was with us both before the 558 era and then in the second half of the 558 era. And of course, Peter Chicago, who kind of was there forever.
Yes, I started with the Mi Amigo, of course, and it just ran through.
So, Peter, just before I ask you your first question, I just have to say, an awful lot has been said about Peter Chicago and his engineering skill and his kind of the way that he went out there so many different times and just got the thing back on its feet again. For those of us who were there with him, Peter had 2 other unique facets to his personality. One was a very wicked sense of humour, and you were never quite sure when you sat down for dinner in the mess room what he was going to come out with next. It was an education listening to some of his tales and arguments. But the other thing is, this is a man who always made you feel personally safe. Whenever Peter was on board that ship, you felt safe. Things were going to be okay. And there was nothing that could possibly harm you, because whatever was going to go wrong, Peter was going to make it right again. So, Peter, I know you had a lot of different eras of Caroline, and in some ways, the final years, with the Mast coming down and things gradually running down, were probably very difficult for you. But did you enjoy them?
Yes, I enjoyed the whole period. It really was a wonderful time. And I suppose I was lucky enough that when I first got my break and was able to fulfill an ambition and take part in offshore radio, I went out to the MEBO 2, Radio Nordsee, and I learned a lot there, probably more than most engineers were likely to learn, because we had to change frequency so often. And so I was able to pick up that knowledge and that experience there, which I then took with me to Caroline, where again it was a question of rebuilding transmitters that had been taken to pieces and parts robbed from them. It was all a building experience, so that by the time we got the new ship, the Ross Revenge, I'd had more experience with rebuilding equipment, with working with rather primitive resources and having to make the best of things. And of course all of that was wonderful experience to have on the Ross Revenge. It wasn't an overnight learning experience, but I was at it for quite a long time, and I was lucky to have that time to sort of learn and gain different skills.
I know you started out with the kind of electronics stroke transmitter skill set that you had when you were much younger, but I think you learned a fair amount about marine engineering over the years.
Yes, well, of course I had to, and one thing I quickly discovered, that although the engines were very big and from the outside maybe a bit off-putting because of their sheer size, they were also a lot easier to work on than a standard car where everything is crammed under the bonnet and you can't get to things. These big marine engines, at least you could get your hands around things, and it was daunting in size sometimes, but in many ways easier to actually get to the bits you needed to get to. And again, it was a question of having to find out how things worked, having to learn the hard way. I mean, I remember on the Mi Amigo when we were towed in and the ship had been to some extent sabotaged by the crew who didn't want it to go back out again. And they'd reversed some of the valves on the saltwater bilge system. Well, I hadn't realized until we had problems getting the pumps working that these were one-way valves, and what they'd done, they'd unbolted the valves and reversed them and bolted them back up again, and when you turned them on, they didn't work. And it was by experience and basically having to sort of look at these things and wonder why on earth the pumps, which had worked perfectly well before out at sea, weren't working. And you do pick up things bit by bit, and of course it's a long learning curve, as they say.
The other thing which you were particularly good at was jury rigging. And in terms of the 558 story, I think, one of your key moments, after the mast came down and before we managed to get any kind of decent lot of supplies out. So the ship had lost the mast. Pretty much everything was gone with it. We hadn't sourced any tower segments. We hadn't sourced any new aerial wire. We hadn't sourced anything else. And yet a signal appeared back on 558 about 6 days later. How did you put that together, and what did you use?
This is after the mast had come down.
Yes.
We inside the ship, we had what we called the liver pipe. It was a clumsy pipe that ran the length of the corridor, and I seem to remember that some of the flanges were in the way, and if you weren't careful, you could bang your head on this pipe. Anyway, Ernie Stevenson, our engineer, decided that we could use that pipe removed from the ship and welded together to make a replacement mast that we could sort of mount on the original ship's mast at the front of the ship. And without Ernie, it wouldn't have happened, because he was an experienced marine engineer and was able to get DJs and other people to help with some of the heavy work. But it was under his direction, and we removed this liver pipe, as we called it, that ran through the ship. And we soon discovered that some of the deposits of the liver oil and the fats, they were still in the pipe. And we had this terrible reek of burning fish that sort of pervaded the ship.
That's right. Just moving across to Nigel, because I know time is tight. Nigel, as well as being on Caroline in the Mi Amigo era, and then again in the earlier part of the 1980s, you came back in 1987, and you were on board, I think, really for two of the most traumatic incidents for Caroline 558, and that is the night of the mast coming down and also the day of the raid. Which one of those upset you more?
I think I'll have to say the raid. The mast coming down was a frightening experience, which put us off the air. But as you were saying earlier on, we had Peter Chicago on board, or coming back if he wasn't there at the time. We knew things would probably, as the ship was safe, we'd get back on the air. But after the raid, I was not so sure. And the fact that the authorities had come on board our home was more troublesome at the time, I felt.
And Nigel actually has a book which came out recently, Ships in Troubled Waters, and I would highly recommend anybody who hasn't already read it to read it, because it puts you inside his mind for a lot of those events. And I was just saying to him earlier that I was reading the chapter about the raid, and I could sense this boiling, bubbling anger welling up at what was happening. So Nigel and Dave as well, because you were on board also for that day.
Yeah.
I know there had been instances where the authorities had come out and sailed around before, and probably the day before it just seemed like another one of those days. When did you realise that things were going to be different?
You could sense something was building, because in the days previous it was clear that the Landward and the crew of the Landward didn't have good intentions. And they wanted to make contact with those on board the Ross Revenge. And it was clear that something was going to happen. We weren't sure who was going to be the aggressor, which side of the channel was going to cause a problem. Was this going to happen from Holland? Was it going to happen from the UK? Were they going to take the boat in? Were they going to arrest everyone on board, just abandon the ship? Were they not going to tow it in? There were so many conspiratorial theories that had built up until the Friday prior to the raid. Times were tense. It wasn't a good time.
And what did you actually feel, or what were people on board thinking and doing just as the ship closed in and it became obvious to you that people were actually going to trespass on board?
I think we slipped into a state of shock in a way. It was a thing that we expected. We could see something, as Dave was saying, was going to happen, but we still weren't quite sure of what would happen and how it would happen. And when it actually took place, I think we were so amazed by the actions of the boarding team that we didn't really understand what was going on initially.
Well, in retrospect, you could say, well, we could have got fire hoses out on deck. We could have tried to repel boarders with the high-power sea hoses. There wasn't the knowledge of the crew on board to carry out those sorts of operations of defence, if you will. We went armed. There's not a heck of a lot we could do. And we didn't know what we could do.
I don't think we really, at the end of it all, expected it to happen. Even then, when we saw the vessels alongside, it's something that never happened to Caroline in the way as it did. I just don't, as Dave said, getting high pressure hoses out, we'd have to have been prepared for that for days beforehand with the experience that we had at the time.
Sorry,
the microphone was off. But the only thing that went through my head, and which we might have tried, and which would have at least made it more difficult, I did consider starting the ship's engine and driving the ship on the anchor chain. It would have taken us in a tight turning circle, and it would have made it more difficult to board the ship. But that was about the only practical thing that I could think of that would have made perhaps some difference. And since they were obviously determined to carry out the raid anyway, I think perhaps it would only have slowed things down. It probably wouldn't have changed the end result.
I mean, one of the sad issues was that we had no contact from land for about 7 or 8 days. And on the morning of the raid, Peter turned up in a tiny boat. And really, that was the only clue.
It was a rubber ring, almost.
And that was...
I was lucky. I was at home the night before, and by this time we did have telephone communication with the ship. So I had a telephone call from the ship where they explained that they'd had this conversation with people in charge on the other boat, warning them that unless the radio station closed down, that the ship was to be raided and taken off the air. This had been a threat issued the previous night. And I decided I was going to try and get to the ship before the morning. I didn't know what, if anything, I could do, but I did want to be on board if and when this happened. And I was lucky. The sea was absolutely flat calm that night, and I took a rubber inflatable to Broadstairs and launched it about 11 o'clock at night, and there was a clear full moon on an absolutely calm sea, and feeling a bit silly and very vulnerable, just headed out from Broadstairs on this clear, sort of bright, sort of moonlit night, and everybody was very surprised, I think, when I arrived.
I'd gone to bed the night before, only for a couple of hours. We were all so tired, and the last thing on my mind was walking into the galley about 5 o'clock in the morning and seeing Peter Chicago cooking breakfast. He wasn't there the night before.
And in the 4 or 5 days previous to Peter arriving on the rubber ring, we were getting all sorts of mind games played. The landward was in contact with us, and they were saying, "Well, look, the Dutch side's been busted, the UK side's been busted. You're on your own. Give up, go home. Come back with us." All sorts of games were being played, and we were getting no information.
So we're just going to play in a little clip here, track number 13.
Well, it's a good afternoon from myself, Peter Chicago, and it does make a change to be sitting here behind the microphone. Here are Wet, 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 and it's called Sweet Surrender. This is Karen White and Secret Rendezvous on Caroline 558. I'm going to play this next track for Graham because last night we worked out that you're probably driving on your way to work at the moment and probably having a chuckle listening to me. This is Roy Orbison. It's 12:30 midday, and here we have the weather. There will be sunny spells, but clouding over later, with a maximum temperature of 18 degrees Celsius. The winds are southerly and fresh, and the sea is slight, with a moderate visibility. In fact, looking out the studio window, there's a few white tops of the waves, and I think indeed the sea is slight. Here is Richard Marks.
So just that period after the raid actually saw you back on the air for the first time in many, many years.
Yes, and I haven't heard those clips before, and I suppose I'm a bit surprised at how sensible it sounded. I don't think I felt very confident at all.
Well, I know we're getting fairly close to the time that we have to vacate the stage. Nigel, you were the last program controller of Caroline 558, and you kind of ran it for the last couple of years. Any final thoughts?
Troublesome period. It really was. I think I got the job about 2 weeks before the raid, or maybe a month before the raid. Was that about right, Dave? It wasn't long before the raid, was it?
I think it's about 6 months.
Was it that long?
Yeah, because I must have spent about 8 months arguing with you.
Yeah, then...
No, it was about 6. I think it's about 4 or 5 months.
Do you want to fight or no? We didn't speak for 30 years. But he's sharing my room tonight, he thinks.
Sounds like the old days are coming back.
It's the funniest thing you've ever said, Steve.
But no, yeah, it was about 4 months, wasn't it? It was.
Well, we were heading into deep waters anyway by then, and we knew. Talking about the raid very briefly, we'd had the French Navy out there as well, so all sorts of things were going on, and every time a boat went out, we had talking about numbers, code numbers that you probably know about that came from the radio stations. We had code numbers especially for tenders on the way. So we know that if there was a boat from the authorities anywhere near the Ross, we'd turn back, and all sorts of things. It was just getting very, very sticky towards the end. But it was. Having said that, I think we can all agree we all enjoyed doing it.
The only thing I'd like to add, which is that when I was talking to some of the officials that were carrying out the raid, obviously it was really, really sort of depressing and horrible to see it happening. But they said, well, you're actually lucky because this raid was planned around the time that you lost the mast. And had the mast not come down at that particular time, the raid, which later took place, was actually scheduled for around that previous time. So I was told, and I can only guess at whether it's true or not, but told that we were lucky to have that sort of intervening period when we did get back on the air, and before the final raid, which did take place and which really did terrible damage to the ship. We never really got over the raid. We got back on the air, but it had sort of stripped the finances of the station. The Dutch side of things never got going again, and it was really the beginning of the end of the station.
Okay, so that was the Caroline 558 era. I'd like to thank everybody who came along today to join me on the stage, and the people who listened, and just also finally for a couple of people from that era who couldn't be here, Fergie McNeil and Dave the Fish. Also, we still remember you. Thanks.